Picture this, you're 7 months pregnant, soaring through the autumn sky in a helicopter with the man you trust most in the world. The view is breathtaking. Your future seems perfect. And then your husband's hands are on your back, pushing you towards certain death 2,000 feet below. This is the true story of Sarah Mitchell, a beloved teacher whose fairy tale marriage became her worst nightmare when greed transformed her loving husband into a cold-blooded killer. What happened next will shock you. But here's what makes this story incredible. Sarah survived the impossible fall, and what she did with her second chance at life will leave you speechless. If stories of survival and justice inspire you, hit that like button soon. Drop a comment and subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove reality is stranger than fiction. The sound of helicopter blades slicing through autumn air should have been magical. For Sarah Mitchell, 7 months pregnant and gripping the safety harness with white knuckles, it felt like a countdown to disaster. She had always hated heights, but David had insisted this helicopter tour would be the perfect way to celebrate their upcoming arrival. "Just breathe, sweetheart," David said, his voice smooth as silk. He placed his hand over hers, but something in his touch felt cold, calculated. "This will be a memory we'll treasure forever." Sarah forced a smile, her free hand instinctively protecting her rounded belly. Inside, their daughter kicked restlessly, as if sensing her mother's unease. The baby had been so active lately, responding to every sound, every movement. Sarah whispered softly to her unborn child, "It's okay, little one. Daddy just wants us to see something beautiful." But David wasn't looking at the scenery below. His eyes were fixed on the helicopter door, his jaw tight with determination. In his mind, he was calculating Stan's timing, and most importantly, the $5 million life insurance policy he had secretly taken out on his wife just 3 months ago. The pilot, Marcus Wells, called out over the headset, "Beautiful view of the valley coming up on your right. Folks, you can see the river winding through the forest like a silver ribbon." Sarah leaned forward eagerly, momentarily forgetting her fear as she marveled at the landscape below. The autumn colors were breathtaking, a tapestry of gold and crimson stretching to the horizon. For a brief moment, she felt the joy David had promised her. She had no idea that her husband was fighting an internal war between the man she had married and the desperate criminal he had become. David's gambling addiction had spiraled completely out of control over the past year. What started as occasional poker games had evolved into a crushing $2.3 million debt to some very dangerous people. People who had made it clear that he had exactly 30 days to pay up, or they would collect their debt in blood. The insurance money would solve everything. He could pay off his debts, start fresh with Brittany, his real estate agent mistress, and finally live the life he deserved. All it would take was one push, one tragic accident, and he would be free. "Look at that," Sarah breathed, pointing toward a waterfall cascading down the mountainside. "Our daughter is going to love hearing about this someday." The words hit David like a physical blow. For just a moment, doubt crept into his resolve. This was his wife, the mother of his unborn child, the woman who had loved him unconditionally through everything. But then he remembered Brittany's ultimatum from the night before. She was tired of being the other woman. She wanted commitment, and she wanted it now. David's hand moved closer to the door handle, his heart hammering against his ribs. The pilot was focused on flying, calling out landmarks through the headset. The timing would never be more perfect. Sarah turned to him, her face glowing with happiness despite her earlier fears. "Thank you for this, David. I know I was scared, but you're right. This is magical." Her trust in him, her complete faith, almost broke his resolve. Almost. But the image of loan sharks, of Brittany walking away, of a lifetime trapped in a marriage that had become a prison, hardened his heart once more. "Yes," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "It's going to change everything." The helicopter banked gently to the left, giving them a spectacular view of the valley spread out below like a living painting. Sarah had finally relaxed, her earlier anxiety replaced by wonder as she watched the world unfold beneath them. She pulled out her phone to take pictures, wanting to capture every moment for their daughter. "Marcus," David called to the pilot, "could you take us a bit lower? My wife wants some better photos." Marcus nodded and began a gentle descent. "No problem. We'll drop down about 500 feet for a better view of the lake." David's pulse quickened. Lower altitude meant less time for anyone to react, less time for Sarah to scream for help. He wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans, trying to appear calm while his mind raced through the final details of his plan. Sarah was completely absorbed in taking pictures, her phone camera clicking away as she captured the stunning scenery. She was thinking about the nursery they had just finished, about the tiny clothes folded in the dresser, about holding their daughter for the first time. The future seemed so bright, so full of promise. "David, look at this view," she said, leaning slightly toward the open side of the helicopter to get a better angle. "I want to get a shot of that old bridge. It looks like something from a fairy tale." When David saw his opportunity, Sarah was positioned perfectly, leaning toward the opening, momentarily distracted by her photography. The pilot was focused on maintaining altitude and avoiding other aircraft in the area. No one was watching David's hands. But as he reached for her, Sarah suddenly turned back toward him, her eyes bright with excitement. "Can you believe how lucky we are? A beautiful home, a baby on the way, and now this incredible experience together? I feel like the luckiest woman in the world." The irony of her words was like a knife to David's chest. Lucky. She had no idea that luck was about to run out entirely. He forced himself to smile, to nod, to play the part of the loving husband for just a few more seconds. "You deserve all the happiness in the world," he said, and for a moment, he almost meant it. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "We both do, and our daughter is going to grow up knowing how much her parents love each other." Those words sealed her fate. David couldn't build a life with Brittany while tied to Sarah and a baby. He couldn't pay his debts or start over while trapped in this marriage. Everything he wanted, everything he needed, lay on the other side of this moment. "Sarah," he said softly, "look out there one more time. I want you to see something special." Trusting completely, Sarah turned toward the opening, leaning forward to see what her husband wanted to show her. The wind whipped through her hair as she gazed out at the landscape below, completely unaware that David was slowly moving behind her. Marcus called out through the headset, "Coming up on Eagles Peak, folks. It's the highest point in the county." The irony wasn't lost on David. Eagles Peak would be Sarah's final view, the last thing she would see before her world went dark. He positioned himself directly behind her, his hands trembling with anticipation and terror. Sarah was still taking pictures, still marveling at the beauty spread out before them. "David, you have to see this. The way the light hits the water, it's like diamonds scattered across the surface." "I see it," David whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "I see everything." He placed his hands on her shoulders, ostensibly to steady himself as he looked over her shoulder at the view. Sarah didn't suspect anything. Why would she? This was her husband, the father of her unborn child, the man who had vowed to love and protect her. But protection was the last thing on David's mind as he calculated the exact angle, the precise amount of force needed to push her through the opening. His hands tightened on her shoulders, and Sarah turned slightly, confused by the sudden pressure. "David, are you okay? You're hurting me a little." Those were the last words she would speak to him as his wife. Time slowed to a crawl as David's hands pressed hard against Sarah's back, propelling her toward the helicopter's open door. The look of confusion on her face instantly transformed to terror as she realized what was happening. "David, no!" she screamed, her hands desperately clawing for anything to hold on to. For one heart-stopping second, her fingers caught the edge of the doorframe, her knuckles white with the strain of supporting her body weight. She hung there, suspended between life and death, her eyes locked on her husband's face. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Think about our baby. Please don't do this." But David's expression was cold, empty of any recognition of the woman who had loved him unconditionally. With deliberate cruelty, he pried her fingers away from the metal frame one by one. "Let go, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the helicopter's engine. "Just let go." Marcus, the pilot, heard Sarah's scream and turned around just in time to see her body disappearing through the doorway. "What the hell?" he shouted, immediately beginning emergency procedures while reaching for his radio. Sarah's body tumbled through the open air, spinning helplessly as the ground rushed up to meet her. The helicopter grew smaller above her as she fell, its engine noise fading beneath the roar of wind in her ears. In those terrifying moments, her only thoughts were of the baby she carried, the innocent life that would die with her. The forest canopy approached with deadly speed. Sarah's last conscious thought was a prayer that somehow, miraculously, her daughter might survive even if she didn't. Then the thick branches of a massive oak tree broke her fall, each impact slowing her descent but causing tremendous damage to her body. She crashed through layer after layer of branches, her clothes tearing, her skin ripping, bones breaking from the repeated impacts. Finally, her broken body came to rest in a thick bed of fallen leaves, unconscious and bleeding, but miraculously still alive. Above, David was already switching into performance mode. He grabbed his head with both hands and let out a wail of apparent anguish that would have won him an Academy Award. "She slipped," he screamed to Marcus. "Oh God, she slipped and fell. We have to go back. We have to find her." Marcus was already radioing for emergency services, his face pale with shock. In 20 years of flying, he had never experienced anything like this. The woman's scream still echoed in his ears, a sound of pure terror that didn't match someone simply losing their balance. "Ground control. This is helicopter, November 7-4. Charlie, we have an emergency. Female passenger fell from aircraft approximately 2,000 feet above Eagles Peak. Need immediate search and rescue deployment." David continued his performance, sobbing and rocking back and forth in his seat. "I should have held on to her tighter. I should have protected her. This is all my fault." But beneath his mask of grief, a cold satisfaction was growing. It was done. Sarah was gone, and with her death, all his problems would disappear. The insurance money would clear his debts, and he could start his new life with Brittany without any complications. Marcus landed the helicopter at the nearest clearing, where emergency vehicles were already beginning to assemble. Paramedics, police officers, and search and rescue teams swarmed the area, preparing for what they assumed would be a body recovery mission. "Sir, I need you to tell me exactly what happened," said Officer Rodriguez, approaching David with a notepad. David took a shaky breath, channeling every ounce of acting ability he possessed. "We were looking at the scenery. Sarah was taking pictures. She leaned out to get a better shot of the lake, and she just lost her balance. I tried to grab her, but it happened so fast." The officer wrote down every word, noting David's apparent distress. There was no reason to suspect anything other than a tragic accident. After all, who would push their pregnant wife from a helicopter as search teams spread out through the forest below? David allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. He had pulled off the perfect crime. Soon, he would be a wealthy widower, free to live the life he had always wanted. But David had made one crucial miscalculation. 2 miles away, in a bed of autumn leaves beneath an ancient oak tree, Sarah Mitchell was still breathing. Sarah's world was nothing but pain and darkness when consciousness finally returned. Every breath felt like knives stabbing into her ribs, and she could taste blood in her mouth. Her body was twisted at an unnatural angle, trapped among the thick branches of the oak tree that had saved her life. She tried to call out, but only a weak whisper escaped her lips. The forest around her was silent, except for the distant sound of search helicopters crisscrossing the sky above the canopy. They were looking for her, but from their altitude, the thick branches hid her completely from view. As her vision slowly cleared, the full horror of her situation became apparent. Her left arm was clearly broken, bent at an impossible angle. Blood seeped from dozens of cuts across her body, and her maternity dress was torn to shreds. But worse than any physical pain was the terrible stillness in her belly. "No," she whispered, her hands moving to her stomach. "Please, no." The baby wasn't moving. The constant flutter of tiny feet that had been her companion for months was gone, replaced by a heartbreaking emptiness. David hadn't just tried to kill her. He had murdered their unborn daughter. Grief threatened to overwhelm her. But survival instinct kicked in. She was still alive, which meant David's plan had failed. If she could just hold on long enough for rescue teams to find her, she could expose him for what he really was. The sound of voices drifted through the forest, searchers calling her name. Sarah tried to shout back, but her damaged ribs made it impossible to draw a deep enough breath. She looked around desperately for something to signal with, her eyes landing on a piece of her torn dress caught on a nearby branch. Using her good arm, She pulled the bright blue fabric free and began waving it slowly back and forth. The movement sent waves of agony through her broken body, but she forced herself to continue. This piece of cloth might be her only chance at survival. Hours passed. The voices grew closer, then faded as the search teams moved through different sections of the forest. Sarah's strength was fading rapidly. Blood loss and shock were taking their toll, and she could feel herself slipping in and out of consciousness. Just as darkness began to claim her again, she heard new voices directly below her position. A team of rock climbers who had volunteered for the search were systematically checking every tree, every ravine, every possible hiding place. "Hey, look up there," called Jake Morrison, pointing toward the oak tree. "Is that fabric caught in the branches?" His partner, Beth Stevens, raised her binoculars and gasped. "There's someone up there. It's her." We found her. Within minutes, the area was swarming with rescue personnel. A helicopter hovered overhead while expert climbers scaled the massive oak to reach Sarah's position. Paramedics prepared their equipment on the ground below, ready to treat what they expected to be massive trauma injuries. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" called the lead climber as he reached her position. "We're here to help. Just stay still and let us do the work." Sarah managed a weak nod, tears of relief streaming down her face. She was going to live, which meant David's betrayal wouldn't go unpunished. As the rescue team carefully extracted her from the branches, she held on to one burning thought: revenge. The helicopter ride to the hospital was a blur of medical procedures and urgent radio communications. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, but she could hear the paramedics discussing her condition in worried whispers. Multiple fractures, severe blood loss, possible internal injuries, and we're going to lose the baby if we haven't already. Those words confirmed what Sarah already knew, but hearing them spoken aloud was like a dagger to her heart. David had taken everything from her: her trust, her future, and now their daughter's life. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had left her alive. And as the hospital came into view, Sarah made a silent vow. She would recover, she would heal, and then she would make David Mitchell pay for every drop of blood he had spilled. While Sarah fought for her life in the trauma bay, David Mitchell was giving the performance of his lifetime in the hospital waiting room, surrounded by police officers, reporters, and concerned friends. He played the role of the devastated husband with consummate skill. "I keep thinking I should have held on to her tighter," he said, his voice breaking at precisely the right moments. "She was so excited about taking pictures for the baby's scrapbook. If I had just been more careful." Detective Frank Torres watched David carefully from across the room. Something about the man's grief felt rehearsed, too polished. In 20 years of police work, Torres had seen genuine anguish. And this wasn't it. But without evidence, his suspicions were worthless. The waiting room filled with Sarah's colleagues from Jefferson High School, where she taught biology. They brought flowers, cards from her students, and heartfelt condolences for David. Their genuine sorrow provided the perfect backdrop for his performance. "She was so looking forward to being a mother," sobbed Jessica Chen, Sarah's closest friend at school. "She had everything planned out, from the nursery colors to the lullabies she was going to sing." David nodded solemnly, accepting their sympathy like a master actor accepting an award. Inside, he was calculating how soon he could file the insurance claim. The policy required a death certificate, but given the circumstances, that should be a formality. Dr. Elena Vasquez emerged from the trauma bay, her scrubs stained with blood. The waiting room fell silent as everyone turned toward her, expecting the worst. "Mr. Mitchell," she said quietly, "your wife is alive." The words hit David like a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face as his carefully constructed world began to crumble. What did you say, Sarah is alive?" Dr. Vasquez repeated. "She suffered severe injuries, and I'm afraid we couldn't save the baby, but she's stable. It's honestly a miracle she survived that fall." The room erupted in cheers and tears of joy, but David heard none of it. His mind was racing, calculating the implications of Sarah's survival. If she remembered what happened, if she told anyone the truth, his life was over. "Can I see her?" he asked, forcing his voice to sound hopeful rather than terrified. "She's sedated right now, but once she's moved to ICU, you can visit briefly." The doctor replied, "I have to warn you, she's been through tremendous trauma. The physical injuries will heal, but losing the baby. David nodded gravely, playing the concerned husband while his mind worked frantically on damage control. He needed to know how much Sarah remembered, and more importantly, he needed to ensure her silence. Detective Torres approached him as the crowd began to disperse. Mr. Mitchell, I know this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you a few more questions about the accident. Of course, David replied, his guard immediately going up. Whatever you need to know. The pilot mentioned that your wife's fall seemed unusual. Her scream suggested terror rather than surprise. Can you think of any reason why she might have been frightened? David's heart hammered, but his expression remained steady. Sarah has always been afraid of heights. She was nervous about the helicopter ride from the beginning. When she lost her balance, she probably panicked. Torres made notes, his pen scratching across the paper. The pilot also mentioned that you seemed prepared for the accident, almost like you expected it to happen. I don't know what you mean, David said, a slight edge creeping into his voice. I was terrified when my wife fell. I'm still terrified. Of course, Torres replied smoothly, just trying to get a complete picture of what happened. Sometimes witnesses notice details that don't seem important at the time. As the detective walked away, David felt a sweat beading on his forehead despite the hospital's air conditioning. He needed to see Sarah, to find out how much she remembered. And if she remembered too much, he would have to find a way to ensure her permanent silence. The game wasn't over yet, but the rules had just changed dramatically. Sarah's first conscious thought was of overwhelming pain. Her body felt like it had been shattered and pieced back together by an amateur. But beneath the physical agony was something worse, the hollow emptiness where her baby's movements used to be. Mrs. Mitchell. A gentle voice penetrated the fog of medication. Can you hear me? Sarah's eyes fluttered open to find Dr. Vasquez sitting beside her bed, her expression kind but professional. The doctor's presence somehow made everything feel more real, more final. My baby, Sarah whispered, though she already knew the answer. Dr. Vasquez took her hand. I'm so sorry. The trauma was too severe. There was nothing we could do. The words confirmed what Sarah's body had already told her, but hearing them spoken aloud broke something inside her. Tears streamed down her face as the full weight of her loss crashed over her like a tsunami. Mrs. Mitchell, the doctor continued gently, you've been through an incredible ordeal. You have multiple fractures, internal injuries, and severe lacerations. But you're alive, and that's nothing short of miraculous. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block out the world, but the memories came flooding back anyway. David's hands on her shoulders, the look in his eyes as he pried her fingers from the helicopter door, the calculated coldness of his voice as he told her to let go. Where is he? She asked, her voice barely audible. Your husband, he's been here constantly, waiting for you to wake up. The man hasn't left the hospital since you were brought in. Sarah's blood ran cold. David was here, in the same building, probably planning his next move. If he had been willing to murder her once, he wouldn't hesitate to try again. I need to tell you something, Sarah said urgently, grabbing the doctor's arm with her good hand. The fall wasn't an accident. David pushed me. He tried to kill me. Dr. Vasquez's expression shifted from sympathy to concern. Mrs. Mitchell, you've suffered a severe head injury. Sometimes trauma can cause confusion, false memories. I'm not confused. Sarah's voice was stronger now, fueled by desperation. He pushed me out of that helicopter. I remember everything. The way he positioned himself behind me, the force of his hands on my back, the look in his eyes. He wanted me dead. The doctor was clearly struggling with how to respond. These are very serious accusations. If you really believe it, I don't believe it. I know it, Sarah interrupted. Please, you have to keep him away from me. He'll try to finish what he started. Dr. Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, studying Sarah's face. Okay, I'm going to call the security and make sure no one visits you without your explicit permission. And I think we should contact the police. Detective Torres, Sarah said immediately. He was asking David questions earlier. I could hear them talking in the hallway, something about the pilot thinking the fall was unusual. The doctor nodded and reached for the phone. As she dialed, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror. She was finally going to tell someone the truth. But that meant David would know his plan had failed completely. A desperate man with millions of dollars at stake would stop at nothing to protect himself. Within an hour, Detective Torres was sitting beside Sarah's bed, listening intently as she recounted every detail of David's betrayal. His expression grew darker with each revelation. "Mrs. Mitchell, I have to ask this question, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Is there any possibility that the trauma has affected your memory, that maybe you're mistaken about what happened?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Detective, I may have broken bones and a head injury, but my memory is crystal clear. My husband tried to murder me for money, and if you give him another chance, he'll succeed." Torres nodded slowly. "Tell me about the insurance policy." "What insurance policy?" Sarah asked, confused. "Your husband took out a $5 million life insurance policy on you 3 months ago. Did you know about that?" The revelation hit Sarah like another physical blow. "5 million, I never signed anything like that. I would have remembered." "Your signature is on the documents," Torres said carefully. "But handwriting can be forged." As the pieces fell into place, Sarah realized the depth of David's planning. This hadn't been a moment of desperation. It had been cold, calculated murder, planned months in advance. "He's going to try again," she said with absolute certainty. "The moment he realizes I remember everything, he'll find a way to get to me." Detective Torres stood up, his jaw set with determination. "Not if I can help it. We're going to post an officer outside your room, and I'm going to start digging into your husband's background. If he's capable of what you're describing, there will be other evidence." As the detective left to begin his investigation, Sarah stared at the ceiling and tried to process the magnitude of David's betrayal. The man she had loved, trusted, and planned a future with had murdered their unborn daughter for money. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had left her alive to tell the story. Detective Frank Torres had seen enough criminals in his career to recognize the signs, and David Mitchell was sending up red flags everywhere. The man's grief felt performative, his answers too practiced, his concern for his wife's condition strangely detached. Torres began his investigation the way he always did, by following the money. A quick check of David's financial records revealed a shocking pattern of debt and desperation. Credit cards maxed out, personal loans in default, and most damning of all, large cash withdrawals to offshore accounts that screamed of gambling addiction. $5 million, Torres muttered to himself as he reviewed the insurance policy paperwork. That's one hell of a motive for murder. His next stop was the helicopter company. Marcus Wells, the pilot, had been visibly shaken by the incident and was eager to share his concerns with law enforcement. "Detective, I've been flying for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what happened up there," Marcus said, his hand still trembling slightly. "That woman's scream. It wasn't surprise or fear of falling. It was pure terror, like someone was hurting her." "Tell me about David Mitchell's behavior during the flight," Torres requested. Marcus frowned, remembering. "He was nervous, but not in the way most people are about flying. He kept asking questions about the safety equipment, the door mechanisms, our flight path. And when she fell..." Marcus paused, shaking his head. "Most people would be screaming, reaching for their loved one, demanding we turn around immediately. He just sat there for a few seconds, like he was processing what had happened." Torres made careful notes. Pilot testimony would be crucial if this case went to trial, but he needed more evidence. His next stop was David's workplace, where he hoped to find colleagues who could shed light on the man's recent behavior. At the investment firm where David worked, Torres discovered a very different picture than the one David had painted. Far from being a successful banker, David was on the verge of being fired for poor performance and suspected embezzlement. He'd been acting strange for months, confided David's supervisor, Janet Walsh. Constantly taking phone calls during work hours, leaving early, coming in late, and there were discrepancies in some of his client accounts that we were investigating. "What kind of discrepancies?" Torres asked. "Money moved without proper authorization? Falsified documents? That sort of thing? We were planning to terminate him next week and refer the matter to prosecutors." The picture was becoming clearer. David hadn't just been in debt. He had been stealing from his employer to feed his gambling addiction. The insurance money wasn't just an opportunity. It was his only way out of a situation that was about to destroy him completely. Torres' phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop digging into David Mitchell or you'll regret it." The detective stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Someone was watching his investigation, which meant he was getting close to something important. But who was sending threats? David himself, or someone else with a stake in keeping the truth buried? His next stop was more delicate, investigating David's personal life. Torres had learned that financial crimes were often accompanied by other forms of betrayal, and David Mitchell was proving to be a textbook case. A canvas of upscale restaurants and hotels in the area yielded several eyewitness accounts of David dining intimately with a young blonde woman over the past several months. Security cameras confirmed what the witnesses described: David was having an affair. The woman turned out to be Brittany Cole, a real estate agent with expensive tastes and a reputation for dating wealthy clients. When Torres showed up at her office, she initially denied knowing David beyond a professional capacity. "I've never seen this man before in my life," she claimed. But her nervous fidgeting told a different story. "Miss Cole, I have security footage of you and Mr. Mitchell at 3 different restaurants over the past 2 months. You were holding hands and kissing. That goes a bit beyond a professional relationship." Brittany's composure cracked. "Look, David told me he was getting divorced. He said his wife was unstable and that he was just waiting for the right time to leave her." "Did he mention anything about insurance money?" Torres asked. "What? No, why would he?" Brittany paused, her eyes widening. "Oh my God, the helicopter accident. You think David—" "But that's impossible. He was devastated when I saw him at the hospital." While Torres leaned forward, "When exactly did you see him at the hospital?" "The night after the accident. He came to my apartment around midnight, crying about how terrible he felt. But he also said something strange. He said that once everything was settled, we could finally be together openly." "Everything settled." "He mentioned something about insurance paperwork, legal procedures. I thought he was talking about funeral arrangements. But—" Brittany's face went pale as the implications hit her. Torres left Brittany's office with a clear picture of David's motives and state of mind. The man had been planning to murder his wife, collect the insurance money, and start a new life with his mistress. It was textbook, almost cliché in its predictability. But textbook crimes still required evidence that would hold up in court. Torres needed more than circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. He needed something that would prove beyond a doubt that David Mitchell had attempted to murder his pregnant wife. The answer came from an unexpected source: Sarah herself. Sarah's recovery was progressing faster than anyone expected, fueled by determination and a burning need for justice. Despite her physical pain, she was thinking clearly about how to expose David's crime. She knew her word alone wouldn't be enough. She needed proof. "Detective Torres," she said when he visited her the next morning, "I want to help catch him." Torres pulled up a chair beside her bed. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've been through enough. Let us handle the investigation." "You don't understand," Sarah insisted. "David is smart, careful. He's probably already figured out that you're suspicious. But he doesn't know how much I remember, and he doesn't know that I've told you the truth." "What are you suggesting?" Sarah's eyes burned with determination. "I want to confront him. Alone. With a recording device." Torres shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. That would be incredibly dangerous. If he tried to kill you once—" "He's going to try again anyway," Sarah interrupted. "The only question is whether we're prepared for it. This way, we control the situation. We get his confession on tape, and you have enough evidence to put him away forever." "Even if I agreed to such a plan, which I don't, there's no guarantee he would confess. He might just deny everything." Sarah smiled grimly. "Detective, I know David better than anyone. He's arrogant, and he needs to feel superior. If he thinks I'm helpless and broken, he'll want to gloat. He'll want me to know how clever he was, how completely he fooled everyone." Torres was quiet for a long moment. Considering the proposal, it was risky, potentially catastrophic if something went wrong. But Sarah was right about one thing: David would likely try to finish what he started, and they needed to be ready. "If we did this," he said slowly, "and I'm not saying we will, it would have to be completely controlled. Hidden cameras, backup officers, emergency protocols." "I understand," Sarah said, "but it has to look real. David can't suspect it's a setup." Torres stood up and paced the small room. The hospital environment actually works in our favor. We can control access, position our people, and ensure medical help is immediately available if something goes wrong. So you'll do it. I'll think about it, Torres replied. But if we move forward with this plan, you follow my instructions exactly. No improvisation, no taking chances. One wrong move and David could finish what he started. That evening, Darchumskas approached David in the waiting room. Mr. Mitchell, your wife is asking to see you. She's been sedated for pain management, so she's a bit disoriented. But she specifically requested that you visit. David's heart rate spiked. This was the moment he had been dreading since learning of Sarah's survival. How much did she remember? What had she told the doctors, the police? Of course, he said, standing up slowly. I've been waiting for her to wake up properly. As he walked towards Sarah's room, David's mind raced through possible scenarios. If she remembered the truth, he would need to act quickly to discredit her story. Traumatic brain injury, medication side effects, grief-induced delusions. There were plenty of explanations for confused memories. But if she didn't remember, if she still trusted him, then he had another opportunity to ensure her permanent silence. David entered the room to find Sarah lying propped up in bed, looking pale and fragile. Her left arm was in a padlock, her face was bruised, and she moved with obvious pain. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had barely survived a fall from a helicopter. David, she said weakly, reaching toward him with her good hand. I'm so glad you're here. He approached the bed cautiously, studying her face for any sign of suspicion or fear. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Confused, Sarah admitted. The doctors say I have some memory problems from the head injury. I remember getting in the helicopter, and I remember waking up here, but everything in between is just fragments. David felt a surge of relief. The head injury had done his work for him. The important thing is that you're alive, he said, taking her hand. When I saw you fall, I thought I'd lost you forever. The fall, and Sarah repeated slowly. I keep having these flashes, these images that don't make sense. Sometimes I think I remember being pushed, but that's impossible, right? I must have just lost my balance. David's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. You were taking pictures, leaning out to get a better shot. You lost your balance and fell before I could catch you. It happened so fast. Obashar nodded, seemingly accepting his explanation. The baby, oh, I'm so sorry, Sarah. The doctors did everything they could. Tears began streaming down Sarah's face, and David felt a brief moment of genuine sympathy. Whatever else she was, Sarah had been a good woman who didn't deserve what had happened to her, but sympathy was a luxury he couldn't afford. Sarah, he said softly, I need you to know something. The insurance policy I took out on you, I'm not going to claim it. It wouldn't feel right, profiting from our tragedy. It was a lie, of course. He had already contacted the insurance company to begin the claims process, but saying the words made him appear noble, selfless, above suspicion. You're such a good man, Sarah whispered. I'm so lucky to have you. David squeezed her hand, playing the role of the devoted husband while his mind worked on the next phase of his plan. Sarah was clearly confused, vulnerable, and isolated. All he needed was the right opportunity to ensure she never remembered the truth about what happened in that helicopter. The perfect husband was about to become the perfect killer. What David didn't know was that every word of their conversation was being recorded by multiple hidden devices placed throughout Sarah's hospital room. Detective Torres and two other officers were positioned just outside the door, ready to intervene at the first sign of danger. Sarah had been acting for her life, playing the role of the confused, grateful wife, while internally screaming at David's lies and manipulation. Seeing him pretend to care about her, knowing he had murdered their daughter, required every ounce of self-control she possessed. David, she said softly, there's something else. The doctors told me about your debts, the problems at work. Why didn't you tell me things were so bad? David's expression flickered for just a moment before he recovered. I didn't want to worry you, especially with the baby coming. I thought I could handle it on my own. $5 million, Sarah continued, watching his face carefully. That's what the insurance policy is worth. That would solve all our problems, wouldn't it? Sarah, please don't think about things like that right now. You need to focus on healing. But Sarah pressed on, following the script she and Torres had rehearsed. It's funny, though. Sometimes I almost feel like the fall wasn't an accident, like someone wanted me to die. Isn't that crazy? David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You're not crazy, sweetheart. You're traumatized. Head injuries can cause all kinds of confusion. But the feeling is so strong, Sarah continued. Like I can almost see hands pushing me, hear a voice telling me to let go. It's probably just a nightmare, but it feels so real. That's exactly what it is, David said firmly. A nightmare caused by trauma. You need to stop thinking about it and concentrate on getting better. Sarah looked directly into his eyes, seeing the cold calculation beneath his mask of concern. What if it's not a nightmare? David, what if someone really did push me? The room fell silent except for the quiet hum of medical equipment. David stared at his wife, trying to determine how much she actually remembered versus how much she was guessing. Who would do such a thing? He asked carefully. Someone who needed money, Sarah said quietly. Someone who had gambling debts and a mistress and saw a way out of all their problems. David's face went completely white. Sarah, what are you saying? I'm saying I remember everything. David, every detail. The way you positioned yourself behind me, the force of your hands on my back, the look in your eyes when you pried my fingers loose. You murdered our daughter, and you tried to murder me. For a moment, David said nothing, his mind racing through his options. Denial was pointless now. Sarah clearly remembered everything. His only choice was damage control. You can't prove anything, he said finally, his voice cold and calculating. It's your word against mine, and you're a traumatized woman with a head injury. Actually, Storm, Sarah said, it's your word against this. She held up a small recording device that had been hidden under her blanket throughout their entire conversation. David's eyes widened in horror as he realized he had been trapped. You recorded me, he said, lunging toward the device. Sarah pressed the call button as David's hands reached for her throat. Within seconds, Detective Torres and two officers burst through the door, tackling David before he could complete his assault. David Mitchell, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Sarah Mitchell and the murder of her unborn child, Torres announced as he snapped handcuffs on the struggling man. This is entrapment, David screamed as they dragged him away. She tricked me. No, Sarah said, her voice strong and clear despite her injuries. You tricked yourself. You thought you were so much smarter than everyone else, but you couldn't resist the chance to gloat. As David was led away in handcuffs, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had accomplished. She had survived his attempt to kill him, and now she had ensured he would pay for his crimes. The recording would be crucial evidence in his trial, but more importantly, it had given Sarah something she desperately needed: closure. David had confessed to everything, admitted to his betrayal and greed, and in doing so had finally freed her from any lingering doubt about his true nature. The perfect husband had revealed himself to be a perfect monster, and now the world would know the truth. 6 months later, Sarah sat in the packed courtroom as the jury foreman stood to deliver their verdict. The trial had been a media sensation, with every detail of David's betrayal splashed across headlines nationwide. The prosecution had built an airtight case using the recording, financial evidence, witness testimony, and David's own increasingly desperate attempts to explain away his guilt. On the charge of attempted murder in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty, the foreman announced. David's face crumpled as the words sealed his fate. His expensive lawyers had tried every possible defense, from claiming Sarah had fabricated the recording to suggesting she had thrown herself from the helicopter in a suicide attempt. Nothing had worked. On the charge of murder in the first degree regarding the death of the unborn child, we find the defendant guilty. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. Justice was finally being served for her daughter, the innocent life that had been stolen along with everything else David had taken from her. Judge Patricia Crown's sentencing was swift and decisive. David Mitchell, you have been convicted of attempting to murder your pregnant wife for financial gain, resulting in the death of your unborn child. Your actions represent a level of callousness and premeditation that shocks the conscience. I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As David was led away in shackles, he turned one last time towards Sarah, but instead of the broken, helpless woman he had tried to destroy, he saw someone transformed by survival into something stronger than he could ever imagine. Mrs. Mitchell, Judge Crown continued, I want you to know that your courage in pursuing justice for yourself and your daughter has been extraordinary. I hope you find peace and healing in the days ahead. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in her throat. The legal chapter of her ordeal was finally closed, but the work of rebuilding her life was just beginning. 2 years later, Sarah stood in the garden behind Jefferson High School, watching her students plant flowers around a memorial bench dedicated to her daughter. The small plaque read, "In memory of hope, love, and second chances." Mrs. Mitchell, called out one of her students. The roses are blooming. Sarah smiled, her hand instinctively moving to her growing belly. At 4 months pregnant, she was beginning to show with the child she was carrying with Tyler Nash, the kind, patient man who had helped her learn to trust again. Tyler had been a fellow teacher who had supported her through the trial and the long months of recovery that followed. Unlike David, Tyler's love was genuine, built on respect and understanding rather than deception and control. He had never tried to rush her healing or make her forget the past. Instead, he had simply walked beside her as she found her way back to hope. The baby's kicking, Sarah said as Tyler approached, placing his hand gently on her stomach. Strong kicks, he said with a smile, just like her mother. Sarah had learned through ultrasound that she was carrying another daughter, and the knowledge filled her with both overwhelm and the inevitable shadow of grief for the child she had lost. But this pregnancy was different. It was chosen, planned, and surrounded by genuine love rather than the false promises that had marked her marriage to David. Do you ever think about him? Tyler asked quietly as they watched the students work. Sometimes, Sarah admitted, but not with anger anymore. David made his choices, and now he's living with the consequences. I can't change what he did, but I can choose how I respond to it. That response had taken many forms over the past 2 years. Sarah had become an advocate for domestic violence survivors, sharing her story at conferences and support groups. She had also worked with insurance companies to help identify potential fraud cases before they turned deadly. But perhaps most importantly, she had learned to live again, to trust again, to believe in the possibility of genuine love and happiness even after experiencing the worst possible betrayal. Mrs. Mitchell, another student approached, holding a small potted plant. Where should we put this one? Sarah looked at the bright yellow marigold, a flower that symbolized healing and new beginnings. Right here, she said, pointing to a spot where the morning sun would nurture its growth, where it can catch the light. As the students worked around her, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. David had tried to destroy her, but instead his betrayal had revealed strengths she never knew she possessed. The fall from the helicopter had been the worst moment of her life, but surviving it had taught her that she was capable of surviving anything. Her daughter kicked again, and Sarah whispered softly, "You're going to have such a beautiful life, sweetheart, full of real love and genuine happiness." In the distance, the sound of helicopter blades could be heard as a medical transport flew toward the local hospital. Sarah listened to the sound without fear, without trauma. It was simply the sound of help arriving for someone who needed it. David Mitchell was serving life in prison, forgotten by everyone except the guards who watched him grow old and bitter behind bars. But Sarah Mitchell was living a life full of love, purpose, and hope. In the end, that was the greatest justice of all. The woman who had fallen from the sky had learned to fly again, and this time, no one would ever clip her wings.